Well, it's October now, the spooky season, so of course I'm going to start talking about horror movies. But since there's so many movies that I could be talking about this month that I still haven't reviewed, I try to narrow it down to some kind of overarching theme. And this year, it's going to be body horror. All the movies I'm going to be talking about this month will have something to do with body horror because I think it's such a fascinating approach to horror. One that's, I think, a little underappreciated in the grand world of horror movies. And starting out, we're not starting with the best, but yeah, this movie I've gotten a few requests to do, and I guess it technically counts as body horror, so here we go. The Wolfman. Now, The Wolfman came out in 2010, was directed by Joe Johnston, and is a remake of the 1940s classic The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr. And here, instead of Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, Larry Talbot, we have Benicio del Toro. And apparently this was a passion project for him. He really wanted to make this movie because Lon Chaney Jr. was an inspiration for him. And I can kind of see why. For one, because they look just like each other. Now, Benicio is clearly a bit older than Lon Chaney Jr. was, but I actually see a bit more of Lon Chaney Sr. in his face than Lon Chaney Jr., but I feel like that's splitting hairs because Lon Chaney Jr. already looks like his dad, so yeah, it's very obvious why this movie got made and why he was cast, and it also makes sense why they got Joe Johnston to direct this movie. Granted, he's not exactly a horror director, but he has a background in creative visual effects. The dude worked on the original trilogy of Star Wars, for crying out loud. So he clearly has an eye for creative special effects. And while a lot of his movies can be kind of hit or miss, I do appreciate the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that a lot of his movies have, like Jumanji, like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, like The Rocketeer. All of these have a very specific visual style and really creative production design and effects. So I was actually kind of excited to watch this movie. I hadn't actually seen this movie before watching it to review for this channel because when it came out, I saw it get panned by critics. So I was like, oh, I'll pass on this. It's just another cheap remake. But after looking into this movie, I started to get a little more excitement, especially when I heard that Rick Baker was involved with the creature design and the makeups and the werewolf transformation, because he's the GOAT. He's the king of monster effects and creature design, because he was the man behind my personal favorite werewolf transformation scene of all time, and that's the one in American Werewolf in London. And his work on that movie was so good that it actually forced the Academy to create a new category for awards that year, because it was just so incredible and he needed the recognition. So when they brought him on, I was like, okay, this movie is starting to look really good. And then when I actually sat down to watch this movie, I was immediately blown away by the production design. This very much feels like a smoky, gothic, Victorian era monster story. It actually reminded me a lot of Sleepy Hollow, a movie that has incredible production design that almost feels like it's a black and white movie in color. And this movie has a lot of that same feel. There's a lot of gray tones. There's a lot of muted color. It almost feels like black and white, and that really works for this movie. So starting off, I was thinking, okay, maybe the critics were a little too harsh on this movie, because so far the movie sounds like a good idea. It's got a pretty decent pedigree. The people behind the camera are incredibly competent. The people in front of the camera, Benicio del Toro, Anthony Hopkins, Emily Blunt, Hugo Weaving, these are good actors, and I was excited to see what they would bring to this movie. And then as the movie rolled along, I started seeing a lot more of what people were having issue with, because this movie does have problems. For one, the pacing is not that great, and I'm usually okay with giving some leniency to pacing in werewolf movies because it's based on the lunar cycle. It's 28 days, so you gotta wait a long time before the next full moon and they wolf out again. So I can almost give that a pass, and this movie does do some creative things to kind of fast track that month cycle where either he's unconscious or missing or taken away to an insane asylum, and for certain lengths of time he's just out of commission until the next full moon. So in that sense, I do have to give the movie props for finding creative ways around that, but you still do feel the kind of slow and dreary pacing, and that's mostly because the actors really don't do a good job in this movie. And it starts with Benicio del Toro as Larry Talbot. And Larry Talbot is an interesting character because he's a dude, an actor that was away in America or touring Europe or whatever he's doing in this version, but he's brought back to his home estate because his brother died and he wants to help with the funeral, and he feels a certain amount of guilt because he was never there for him, which is a decent enough spin on the original. It's not exactly one for one, but ultimately not that much is different plot-wise. It does follow more or less the same plot for the majority of this movie. Now we'll get to the third act and how that goes off the rails later, but early on in this movie you're actually kind of putting the pieces together. You're introduced to these characters, but the characters are just not interesting. And for Benicio del Toro, that's because his acting style is so underplayed and mumbly and just feels like he doesn't care about anything that's going on. Even when there's really horrific things happening to him and he needs to be freaking out, it just feels like he doesn't actually care that much about what's going on. And if he doesn't care, well, then the audience doesn't care. And so we don't actually identify with Larry Talbot. And that's a big shortcoming of this movie, because say what you want about the original, and I honestly don't have that much love of the original. I appreciate it for what it did for establishing werewolf lore, and I have a whole other video on that version of the Wolfman out there to kind of explain my thoughts. But ultimately, I don't think it holds up particularly well, and this movie does nothing to further the lore and character and mythos and dynamics that were established in the original Wolfman to make it more interesting, more engaging, really telling a cohesive story, because this one borrows a lot from the original, but it borrows the same things that were already done in the original. And the stuff that is new and fresh, like the werewolf killings, we do see a lot more actual violence and splatter and werewolf killings. That all feels like it was pulled from An American Werewolf in London or Silver Bullet or a million other werewolf movies that we've already seen before. So even then, it's not that creative. I just feel like a lot of this movie is just spinning its wheels, trying to stay very faithful to the original Wolfman, but at the same time, just not understanding how that original movie works or how to make it better. And that's probably the biggest disappointment in this movie, is the script. Because there was something about this movie that was really rubbing me the wrong way. It wasn't pulling all the ideas together that it should be in this kind of movie. But unlike vampires and mummies, werewolves don't really have a concrete historical legendary mythos that existed before the dawn of the werewolf movie in movies like the original Werewolf of London, or more popularly, the original Wolfman. So because of that, the Wolfman had to kind of make up a lot of its own stuff, a lot of its own legends and a lot of its own mythos, that nursery rhyme or poem that even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. That was completely made up for the movie. And because of that, one of the things that really hurts the original Wolfman is that they have a lot of these different ideas, but it never really comes together. The idea of lycanthropy as a psychological disorder is addressed, and it's talked about a lot in that movie, and it's used in tandem with that poem. And then there's the gypsies and the gypsy folklore, where this werewolf idea seems to have actually come from, and they're clearly behind all these werewolf attacks. And those ideas all come together around the character of Larry Talbot, where he's not sure if he's just crazy or if he is actually a werewolf. And while all the pieces are there in that movie, the script doesn't really bring them together in a way that feels ultimately satisfying, where you finally get what this werewolf stuff is all about. And I couldn't help but think that this movie, this remake, kind of reinventing the werewolf, bringing it back, but still harkening back to the original. In fact, this movie has a lot of the same pieces from the original, like lycanthropy, like that poem and the gypsies. It's all there in pieces, but they don't bring them together in a cohesive whole like I wanted them to, because that was a big shortcoming of the original. It didn't really come together as a mythos. Here, they could have really distilled it down. They could have put all the pieces together. They could have explained things and made it just this much richer lore that I think a lot of werewolf fans have been dying for, because honestly, a lot of my favorite werewolf movies are not this Victorian, old England kind of movie. It's the more modern werewolf stories. Seeing werewolves pop up in the contemporary days, like An American Werewolf in London, like Silver Bullet, like The Howling. Those movies really grip us because we see it in the modern lens. But if you're gonna do it as a period piece, you have to justify why it's in that period. Sure, people were a lot more superstitious, and there was a lot more urban legends going around, especially with the traveling gypsies and all that. So I really feel like this movie dropped the ball in giving us a concrete werewolf legend to really sink our teeth into, to understand fully before we start doing all the crazy werewolfing out and all the killings that we see in this movie. Because it seems to me that this movie only had one original idea, and that is to make Sir John Talbot, played by Anthony Hopkins in this version, the full-on evil bad guy of the movie. Not only is he a really obvious twist villain, and the movie does nothing to hide the fact that, he might be keeping a secret, because he's always kind of winking and snarling at the camera a little bit. And I love Anthony Hopkins. I think he's a great actor. I love him even when he's in a bad movie. He's usually one of the better parts of this this movie, but here he is just bringing nothing to this movie at all. He is just hamming it up. He's so directionless. Like, everybody in this movie is directionless. Not him, not Emily Blunt, who's another fantastic actor. She's given nothing to do, next to no personality. But I will say, as long as we're doing the rundown of actors, Hugo Weaving was at least interesting as the inspector, the police officer that's trying to hunt this werewolf. He at least brings a certain amount of hammy charisma to this role, and he knows exactly what kind of movie he's in, and he's just locked in. And when the movie focuses on him, it's actually pretty enjoyable. He's got some pretty good one-liners, but unfortunately, he's not in the movie a lot. But the movie really focuses on the Talbots, Larry and Sir John. And Sir John in this movie ends up becoming the other werewolf. He's the werewolf that scratched and bit Larry Talbot. He's the one that killed his brother. He's the one that killed his mother. He's been the werewolf at large that has been talked about. And while this could be an interesting development with a better script, this just flies in the face of all the gypsy stuff and all the lycanthropy stuff that has been kind of built up in pieces, and now we're just doing a father-son werewolf showdown. Now the son, who's got the werewolf curse, needs to face off against his dad and kill him. And admittedly, it is kind of a fun fight when you see the two werewolves throwing down. In that very primal, entertainment-focused part of your brain that only wants to be entertained by interesting visuals, that fight scene does bring something to the table. It's interesting. It's not particularly well executed, and a lot of the CGI looks horrible, but is fun, and I'd be more accepting of it if that didn't just fly in the face of the already established werewolf lore. And why would you even bring in the gypsies if you're not going to have the gypsy man? Or they could have actually made the gypsy woman the werewolf in this movie, since we don't really see Bela from the original at all in this movie. We only see the gypsy woman, so I kind of thought that she might be the werewolf in this version, and that would be interesting. Having a she-wolf in this movie, that's something that we haven't seen in a Wolfman movie yet. You could have really done something creative there, but no, we just have two Wolfman costumes that basically look identical, but one is a little pudgier and a little more Anthony Hopkins-ish than the Benicio del Toro more classic Wolfman look. But now I think it's time to talk about what may be the most important part of any Wolfman or werewolf movies. How good are the character designs and the transformation scenes? Because that, for me, is what I go to a werewolf movie to see. I want to see the human become the animal, and how do you pull off that transition? Because when I heard Rick Baker was brought on board, I was so excited, because American Werewolf in London is my favorite werewolf movie ever, but they really did him dirty with this movie. They brought him on because he was so excited to do these creature designs and werewolf transformations, and the actual creature design is pretty lackluster. It's basically the traditional Wolfman look. They don't really take any liberties. Maybe they make his claws a little bit longer. Maybe they make the muzzle a little bit more detailed. But ultimately, it's the same bear look that I just didn't really like in the original Wolfman. I didn't think it looked all that convincing. I thought he looked more like a bear than a wolf. He has a very short muzzle. And for me, werewolf really needs that elongated snout, that snarly, really nasty looking long face that makes it look canine. And here the Wolfman doesn't. They stick to the classic Lon Chaney Jr. look. And so I could see for Rick Baker just having to redo that look again would not feel that fulfilling from a creative standpoint. But at least he could do some really interesting creature transformations. That's what he made a name for himself doing, so here he can do it again. But no, because they're all CGI. There's not a single practical werewolf transformation to be seen in this movie. It is entirely CGI, and 9 times out of 10 it looks really fake and cheap. Now, some of the interesting animation going on with the CGI werewolf transformation do harken back to some of his older work, seeing the hands distort and stretch, seeing the feet stretch and see the body and back kind of transform before your eyes. A lot of those shapes and forms to transition from the human to the animal do kind of resemble an American Werewolf in London. So I'll say, okay, at least his talents weren't completely useless, because I'm sure he gave a lot of input to the CGI department on how to actually animate this stuff. And if I am giving some praise to this movie, I do appreciate some of the more body horror aspects of the transformation, the way his hands distort and just look like they dislocate, and the sound design is actually pretty convincing. And by far the best element in these transformations is when his face transforms, and while the face itself looks super fake, I'm talking like really bad, like the Mummy level fake, it just doesn't look convincing at all. But when he opens his mouth to growl and snarl, you see his teeth change, and the actual dental work going on in there is actually pretty interesting. I do like what they did with that aspect. That was something that was original that I hadn't seen before, because we've seen change-o hands and feet and face, but the actual teeth changing, that was something new. I appreciated it, but that doesn't really make up for the complete lack of practical effects and the complete wasted talent of Rick Baker in this movie. Because if I were him, I'd be very upset with how this movie turned out and how his work was used. Because he clearly has a passion for this kind of movie and these kind of creature effects. But at the end of the day, we really didn't get Rick Baker creature design or creature effects. Because everything he did on this movie just felt like either Joe Johnston or the studio was like, no, we have to keep it looking like the Wolfman from the original. And no, we have to use CGI. We have to push the boundaries of CGI. We can't do practical. And that just kneecaps this movie as a whole. Because if this movie really did harken back to the practical effects of the 80s when monster movies were really interesting and cool and creative, this movie would have been a completely different story. Sure, the acting still might have been some hot garbage, but at least we would have had some really cool Wolfman action, Wolfman transformation scenes to kind of make up for it. But no, this movie is just kind of a big disappointment. And instead of expanding on some of the themes and concepts that were brought up in the original, this just feels like it kind of copy and pasted all those themes and concepts just directly, and then kind of went its own way with a few different ideas, like making Sir John the bad guy, which, I don't know, that just feels lazy to me. It feels like the first thought that popped into somebody's head and they just ran with it. Because it takes away from Larry's struggle as a werewolf when he has another guy that is in the same boat he is and has this kind of devil on his shoulder attitude. You don't get that sense of isolation, this sense of nobody understands me, and self-harm and wanting to end your own life that was so prevalent in the original. Really, most good werewolf stories tackle this idea of ending your own life for the greater good. And this movie just really doesn't do that. And it was so disappointing on a script level, on an acting level, and of course, on a visual effects level. This movie just doesn't hold up. It's got some great production design. It's got some really talented people in front of it and behind the camera, but unfortunately, it just didn't come together. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about the Wolfman? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my Nerdy Talk, and I'll see you in the next video.